Welcome everybody to our session, a series called Centering Indigenous Pedagogies in Math Education. It's good to see everybody here and so many people here. I'm going to pass right now to my colleague Leyton, who will give a land acknowledgement.
Why, everyone, good afternoon from Kehl territory. I'm super grateful to be joining this incredible group of folks, and we're looking forward to some wonderful learning. This is our third year in the series. I'm joining you from what is currently rainy and wet, which I have been taught by local knowledge holders, is for us in this territory the change of the season. So excitingly, the skies are darker. But it's also story time, so that's exciting. We recognize here in what is Syilx territory that the Syilx have been here for time immemorial, are stewards of this place, and this is their natural world and habitats. And I also understand that people, places, and language aren't separate. So I'm just grateful for the learning that I'm able to do in this place. And I just highlight in the bottom corner this beautiful project that's a Syilx-led project on Syilx land, which is a floodplain reclamation site. And I've been so fortunate with our grade 3-4 research classroom to be able to come every season and be part of the restoration work. And there is so much math in the learning that just presents itself if we just pay attention. We recognize that we're all joining from different places, and we invite you, if you'd like at this time, if you haven't yet, to acknowledge the territory and perhaps the relationship you're building with it in the chat box. Thanks, Cynthia.
So we wanted to also acknowledge our partners in this project, which includes the Indigenous Mathematics Education Network, the David Robitaille Professorship in Mathematics Education, which I hold the chair for, and Dogwood 25, the BC Ministry of Education, and the Rural Education Advisory. Oops, sorry, I did all of it. Is there anything more you want to add?
It truly is a collaboration. We are grateful for the funding that we received from the Ministry of Education to help us put on this series. And Cynthia has the David Robitaille Chair, and I have Eleanor Rick Chair in Rural Teacher Education. And so the Rural Education Advisory is delighted to be co-sponsoring this series as well.
Thank you. Okay, so as previously mentioned, we have our theme is of the entire series is called Centering Indigenous Pedagogies in Mathematics Education. And the theme for this particular, the first of 4, is on mathematical moments of becoming storywork ready. So let me introduce you to Gagit, a two-face transformation mask carved by Haida artist Reg Davidson. And Reg, I'll just give you a little introduction to Reg. Reg comes from a long line of carvers and artists, and very well known for his carved masks. That you can see him working on one here, poles and canoes. He carves and then beautifully performs his art as a member of a Haida dance group called the Rainbow Creek Dancers. And he dances, carves, and sings an old mass at Haida Gwaii. And I have just a couple images here to just share with you where this work comes from, because it's so connected to the land and place of Haida Gwaii, situated in the Pacific Northwest, just between Vancouver and Alaska. So you can see there on the map where it is, and Reg is in the upper north, kind of northeast part of the islands, and another just image of what the place and land look like there. I first met, I want to just go back to the mask itself. Should put another one in there. But I first met Reg and this two-face transformation mask when he was in the middle of putting the two faces together. And what we're looking at now is one of the faces, the Gagit, sorry. And I can remember when Reg was describing Gagit as this wild spirit creature that had a spirit that was really strong. It was so strong it couldn't die. And there's another part of this mask, which is the transformation, and we'll meet the other piece of the face a little later in the session. So for the session today, I'm just going to skip here. Oh, sorry. I wanted to just also mention that we have upcoming sessions in 2004. We have session 2 on January 23, session 3 on February 27th, and session 4 on April 9th. And each of these has themes related to centering Indigenous pedagogies in math education, focused on place and land and culturally responsive practices and assessment. And you can, if you signed up for this one, you'll automatically get the links to the next series, for the next session. And so I want to click here. Okay, good. So we have 2 educators who will be sharing their stories of becoming Storywork ready. And you can see in this map that part of the team is located in the western part of Canada and a little bit sort of northern BC, central BC, and another is located in Toronto. So that gives you a sense of the places that we're coming from. And we also have, so this is our team here. We have Karen from Salmon Arm. We have Dahlia from Seneca College in Toronto, Janice from School District number 38, Richmond, and also at the University of British Columbia. We have Sara, Florence Davidson from Simon Fraser University, and we have me from University of British Columbia, and Joanne Archibald from University of British Columbia, and Leyton from University of British Columbia. So we're all excited to be with you in this particular session. The plan is for us to have 2 stories shared by 2 educators, and then we'll have some discussion and questions related to each of their stories of becoming Storywork ready. So let pass to now Joanne Archibald William to share with us a little bit more about Indigenous Storywork principles and becoming Indigenous Storywork ready. Joanne.
Great. Thanks, Cynthia, and great to be with everyone today. I join you from the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in the Vancouver area. And I am a citizen of Stalo Nation with ancestry in the Statliam First Nation. With Indigenous Storywork, I was able to and had the privilege to work with Stalo and Coast Salish elders for many years, learning about how we could make meaning with and from Indigenous, traditional, and life experience stories. So you can imagine perhaps today that we are gathered together, and when we actually begin our gatherings, we hear the spokesperson facilitating the event say, "My dear ones, the work is about to begin." And when we hear that phrase, then we pay attention. We give our full attention, use all our senses in experiencing what is to happen. And with this idea, we bring the concept of story together with work to give it that serious attention. And you could see there are principles on this slide, and the ones that we could call the 4 R's of respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity. Some of those will be discussed today by our 2 presenters. And sometimes we could think of these 4 R's as becoming Storywork ready as educators to help us become open and ready to engage with various Indigenous stories, and a way to bring that together with math education. And the other principles of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy may be ways that we work with the stories. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to very briefly highlight some aspects of these 4 R's. And these 4 R's have many meanings. And today I will only present just a few for us to consider. So with respect, I've heard elders say, it's important that we listen with our 3 ears. Of course, the 2 we hear with, but we bring that together with our heart. So it could be a way too of using our various senses and our aspects of human development to bring together heart, mind, body, and spirit. And when we are listening and engaged in this way, we also can open ourselves to listening to, perhaps reviewing a story, but to be open to different story structures that may not always have a tidy beginning, middle, and end. And also to learn to have patience. In this busy world of ours, we sometimes want things right away, but it is important to kind of relax, have some patience, to be open. And with that, we also need time to learn various responsibilities about stories, which could be developing working relationships with students' families and Indigenous community members, learning various cultural protocols, learning about the cultural context of the story. With our diverse Indigenous peoples, of course, in Canada, if we're focusing our work here, there are many differences, and we need to know about the protocols that pertain to particular Indigenous communities. And along with that, to also understand how colonization has impacted Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and also impacted influenced our own perspectives about indigeneity. Another principle is reverence. And a way to think of this, which is very subjective, is really to be open when we are practicing respect, but to be open to experience this awe in students. As educators, we love students, and I love to watch students learn, and how they learn, what they talk about, I feel awe when I observe and listen, and especially with my own grandchildren, I think of that, and I just have this awe of the way that students will learn and also attach or relate to various stories. And then to think of reciprocity as a way that we can share what we learn. This is an important Indigenous teaching, that if we are given the opportunity to learn, we also have this both responsibility and an opportunity to share with others through reciprocity, through giving back to them or strengthening Indigenous knowledges. So that's just such a very quick overview of 4 Rs. And through this session, we will hear other perspectives of some of these principles. And we're going to do that right now with our first presenter. I'd like to introduce Dahlia Benedikt, who is a community-based educator and instructor at Seneca College, based in Toronto. And Dahlia also works with some folks at the Toronto Metropolitan University. So Dahlia, let's turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for that introduction, for your teachings as always. And I'm coming in here as always a learner and continuing to learn about what it means to be story ready and to engage in story work ready and to engage in the story work principles. And thank you all for joining, and I'm honored to be with you today to exchange ideas around centering Indigenous pedagogies in mathematics education. As Joanne mentioned, I'm a community-based educator. A lot of my background in education has been in movement-based work and community-based work. And right now I'm also teaching in higher education and working in the Center for Teaching and Learning in Toronto Metropolitan University. And I'm also a student in the Math Education Master's Program, and lucky to be a student of Cynthia's and an admirer of her work and also Joanne's work. So if you could switch to the next slide. So I'm speaking to you today from the ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, Wendat First Nations, and the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and long cared for by many other First Nations and newcomers. And the story that I'm sharing today is about an outdoor after-school activity that took place in High Park, which is a large 400-acre park in Toronto. It's just under half of the size of Stanley Park in Vancouver. And as you can see in the Google Map snapshot there on the left that I took, the park is part of a wide network of natural lands and rivers that snake through the city and make up an even wider network of trails that Indigenous people have called the Carrying Place Trail, which has been an important trade route dating back at least 11,000 years. And so in the next slide, if you can switch to the next slide, there's a map of an old map of the Carrying Place Trail, which includes High Park. So the activity I'm sharing today a story about is an after-school outdoor educational inquiry that I ran with my sister in late February this past year with a group of 6 14-year-olds who are affiliated with a Jewish outdoor education organization that runs after-school programs and camps around nature connection. And my sister is the program lead for the group, and she and I are both Jewish educators and settlers who are in continual conversation about how our own Jewish cultural frameworks may be engaged as collective sources of guidance for how to act on our responsibilities as non-Indigenous people on these lands. So as educators, a lot of this involves responding to a reality in which certain stories are privileged over others. And so, part of our work is to unsettle those stories and to reveal the multitudes of histories and epistemologies and other ways of knowing that have been enduring before and within and against and beyond it. So our existing relationship serves as a good context for engaging in Joanne's Indigenous Storywork principles. And so I shared these with my sister. I shared a video that where Joanne was introducing them as a starting point for our planning process, which helped us to ground ourselves in how we might approach our exploration of the park. And our guiding aim in the activity was to use mathematics guided by Indigenous Storywork as a way of exploring the land and uncovering some of the past and present activities of High Park, including and specifically those that often get missed or disregarded. And so, the principles helped us to frame how we would approach these ways of being that haven't been initially noticed or validated, and to do so with respect, with reverence for different ways of knowing, with consideration of ourselves in relation and our responsibilities to those narratives and truths. And so it took place after the sun had already set. It was dark. There was snow covering the ground, and I audio recorded parts of the activity as part of a class project for Cynthia's class. And over the course of the activity, we walked through the park down into the forest trails towards Grenadier Pond, which is a large pond there, and river. And interspersed with activities, we also had provided kids with text excerpts that they would read out loud, which offered different angles of history that complicated what was written on the park plaques and situated the park as an important site of Indigenous activity for thousands of years. So I'm going to share 2 out of 3. There were 3 different math moments that we encountered together, and I'm going to share 2 of them. So for this first one, our guiding question for this math moment was, what stories can we trace of the land's activity? And so as we descended off of the paved road of the park and into the trails, we were instructing participants to put on their math tracking glasses and to see what they could uncover in the land. And the group had been practicing animal tracking identification together for a while, but this activity was also getting them to notice how much math they were actually employing in the process. So counting segments, examining shapes and patterns, seeing the level of pressure and impact in the snow, examining the spatial progression in order to imagine the size and shape of the animal, how it may have been moving. And so there were all sorts of things that we found in the land. There was one moment when the group found a set of prints and decided that it was a rabbit of some kind. And there was another time when a set of prints looked like a canine. And so the group talked about how they could tell the difference between a wild dog and a domesticated dog, and what that would look like in terms of the shape in the snow. And so after some time, we had participants break off into groups and explore the area and develop stories of animal activity based on what they could trace on the land. And then when we came to hear each group's stories and examine their evidence, the rest of the group was given the task of suggesting some counter narratives to the one that they presented to challenge their understandings of what could have conceivably taken place there. So one of the groups had hypothesized that the same rabbit they had seen earlier had identified that they had seen earlier was rushing to have tea with his grandma and was breaking a few small branches along the way. And so this is how the group kind of challenged the story. All of these names are pseudonyms. So, they were questioning the story by questioning its spatial soundness, asking how could an animal go in a straight line here and break this piece of wood in a different direction. If it fell over, there would be other marks on the ground. Which arm would he be using to grab the walking stick? And how could that be the animal that we saw, because the tracks don't really look the same. So, in this way, the math the kids were using were revealing how we tend to overlay our own prior assumptions onto the stories that we find. And so it illuminated this text that we read at the beginning of the activity, in which Rabbi Lisa Edwards says, if donkeys read the Torah, all the donkey stories would jump out at them. And so it takes an added level of awareness to be able to see those stories that don't pertain to us or that may emerge in unfamiliar ways or forms, and outlines our responsibility to look for and honor those stories. So this is the math moment too. I'm not going to expand too much on this for the sake of time, but in this math moment, it was an inquiry activity where we were exploring how old the forest is. We talked about Indigenous protocols around controlled burning that are very ancient, long-standing practices that are in the park that take care of the black oak forest there. And we used mathematics to figure out how we could estimate the age of a tree without cutting the tree down. And so that involved measuring the circumference. It also involved doing some tree identification and using the tree's growth factor to calculate the estimated age. And the group found their tree to be an Austrian pine, and they estimated it to be 142 years old. And so we talked about where the tree came from, if this was an invasive species or it was a native species. How did it get its name, Austrian pine? And it also allowed us to wonder together about what was happening when the tree was born, and opened up space to pay reverence to the lifetimes of activity that the tree was born home to and witness to. So next slide. So in this math moment, we use mathematical concepts of value and ratio to really pay reverence to High Park as a sacred site and a memorial ground, as well as a site of contested claims to land and truth. So the question that guided us was how does power shape the stories we focus on? What does it feel like to not be believed? So at this point, we were deep in the forest trail and settled in a circle at the north point of Grenadier Pond. And we read in an excerpt that in 1805, the city of Toronto purchased the land to be known as Treaty 13 from the Mississaugas of the Credit for 10 shillings and a small handful of provisions. And then 30 years later, in 1836, John Howard purchased High Park's 160 acres from the city of Toronto for $1,000. And so from here, the math task was clear. Participants immediately began to think through the land and monetary value transfers of the two purchases and consider the relative worth placed on each transaction. And that helped us to get a sense of how much the city of Toronto actually profited off of what ended up being less than 0.1% of the land. And so we talked about why the city of Toronto would place such little value on the treaty with the Mississaugas as compared to the purchase from John Howard. And so we, some of the things that the kids raised were around racism and profit. And then we turned our attention then to the place where we had been sitting. And we read that as many as 57 Algonquin burial sites were said to be were said to be there, that people had been buried in the park. And there had been evidence of this in 1921, but despite this evidence, city officials have not formally recognized the presence of ancestral remains. And in the last 15 years, the area began to be used as a BMX bike course. And so an Indigenous-led group had begun lobbying for the preservation of sacred sites. And so you can see that on the next slide, on the right there. And so the city of Toronto eventually did conduct an archaeological assessment and concluded that no remains were found, which cleared the site of archaeological concern. And so as we processed these events, we talked about what counts as evidence, what it takes for the city to believe the accounts of Indigenous people. And we asked them to reflect on our own Jewish practices around death and how we honor the burial sites of our loved ones. And we asked group members to think about times when they weren't believed and times when they may have contributed to the disbelief of others. And we asked, how do our beliefs inform what is deemed worth protecting? And so in the closing circle afterwards, here's a quote from the participant. It's not all about proof, it's also about context. What does the city of Toronto have to gain by not believing it? And what would the Indigenous people have to gain by lying? And so, yeah, now you can move on to the next slide. So this activity, and there was more to say about this, but we were exploring the storied landscapes of High Park, which brought us as educators to deepen our understandings of the Storywork principles and what it looks like to ignite the group to pay attention and pay respect to the stories there. And in this activity, we tried to embody these principles ourselves. And what happened was that we were also modeling and inviting kids to also embody these principles as a shared stance. And so there's this Jewish concept that the group often uses for themselves, calling themselves Shomrei Adama, which means guardians of the earth. And so in the activity, we were able to connect into this ongoing theme as a way of thinking about our own responsibilities to protect and to steward, to respond to colonial imposition, to keep alive the stories of the land as responses to what we had explored. And as we continued the activity, we designed it as a deepening process to bring the group to pay reverence for the land as a sacred site and as a burial ground. And it was important for us to draw on our own Jewish rituals of honoring the dead as a way to have kids recognize and express the importance of Indigenous protocols and sacred practices that tend to the spirit world. And so that connection to our cultural traditions was important, and also honoring other forms of truth and the way that truth is validated, and the fact that we don't necessarily need physical evidence in order to believe Indigenous people or to fight to protect the land. And so, yeah, and these connections helped us to stir a sense of justice seeking as a group for Indigenous people and for all living inhabitants of the park and their rights, and who gets to decide what happens in High Park and who is put at the center of the process, and our responsibility to all of these histories and unfolding futures. So that's my story. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dahlia. As part of this gathering that we are attending today, after the work has been completed, we often in Koselish and Stalo gatherings, we ask individuals to share their thoughts, their feelings, their observations of what they have experienced in the gathering. And we call these individuals the witnesses, like our cultural witnesses. And so today, as part of our learning, we are going to have two witnesses share their thoughts, their feelings, their ideas, even questions, very briefly. And with the two witnesses, we have Sara Florence Davidson, who has worked as a K-12 educator in schools and is now assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. And after Sara speaks, then we'll have Janice Novakowski, who is a teacher consultant for K-12 mathematics and numeracy in the Richmond School District. So let's turn, I would call as a witness now in this cultural gathering, Sara Florence Davidson to come and share some words.
So I am joining you from the unceded lands of the Katzie, the Kwantlen, and the Semiahmoo peoples. My Haida name is Anja Gusandlans, which means Killer Whale Woman of the Dawn, and I belong to the Yakut clan. And Reg Davidson, who Cynthia introduced you to at the beginning, is my uncle, my father's brother. So I'm very, very honored to be here to chat with you folks this afternoon. I will say that mathematics is not my area, but I always love hearing about the way that folks are taking up Kwam Hyam's work. And I continue to do a lot of this in the area of stories and English language arts. And so I just want to begin by thanking Dahlia for the beautiful presentation. And I had so many ideas, and so I was busy writing down all of the ideas. So I'll just share with you a little bit of what I was thinking about as I was listening to her presentation. And I think one of the big ideas that really stood out for me was, I'm often asked about how do non-Indigenous folks take up this work in a way that is respectful and honoring. And I really appreciated the way that they were guided by the by both the Indigenous Storywork principles, but also what they described as their cultural knowledge and cultural traditions. And I thought that was a beautiful way to work with and learn from and be guided by these principles. And so the other thing that I appreciated was listening to how the Indigenous Storywork principles were used from start to finish. Often what happens is we think about these principles as a way to make meaning, or in the work that I do, of a story, as opposed to beginning from a place of planning. And so what I heard was with the discussions and the conversations that went on in the beginning, and how these principles assisted with the initial planning and guiding the experience for the young folks that they were working with. And so when I was thinking, when I sort of listened through to the way that the different moments were being described, I really loved the idea of engaging with text in place. I thought that was a wonderful way to kind of challenge some, especially with those signs. So a wonderful way for young folks to have those experiences and to be engaged with those experiences in the moment, and also to engage with perhaps contradictory texts. I thought that was quite lovely. And I think it's it can have such a big impact. And I really loved the moments that were described, the questions that were being explored, and I felt that they connected so clearly back to those first four principles that we use to become Indigenous Storywork ready. I also loved this lens of honoring the land alongside the lens of mathematics. I often say that that Cynthia sees the world through mathematics, and I think it's a very unique quality, and so when I've listened to her speak about mathematics, I'm always struck by that. And I really loved the way that you brought together this sort of view of mathematics being everywhere and that we are immersed in mathematics. And I think that, often folks have fear around mathematics, and this is a beautiful way to invite folks into this experience of mathematics. And I really also love the way that you didn't separate. I think often when we think about indigenizing mathematics or decolonizing, maybe more specifically indigenizing mathematics, we quickly go to a place where we're counting something that may be stereotypically indigenous, and that is definitely not the work that we're trying to do. And so you did this beautiful way of bringing in the land and kind of bringing these two ideas together. And I think I also loved the way that you worked with Indigenous Storywork principles as a way to think about an ethical practice. And I feel like, even though that maybe wasn't the initial intent, that those principles do speak to the ethics of how we interact with other people, other beings, the land. And you've done a beautiful job of doing that here. And then my only question at the end, and it doesn't need to be answered now, but just perhaps to think about, is I was really curious about how this experience has transformed the ways in which those young people have engaged with the land, have thought about mathematics. Does it come back into the classrooms with them, these ideas? And how have they re-engaged with the land in experiences following the ones that you described? So,
Thanks, Sara. Now I'll turn to Janice.
Just making sure I'm unmuted there before I start talking, still working on that. Thank you for inviting me to witness Dahlia's story sharing. I'm joining you this afternoon from the traditional and unceded lands and waters of the Hunkaminam speaking peoples. And one of the things that was particularly striking for me, Dahlia, was how the principles of interrelatedness and holism were just so authentically and naturally embedded in these learning experiences that you co-constructed on the land with the youth, as well as with your sister as co-educators. And not everyone will be privy to this, but I'm just going to read a small piece from a paper that Dahlia wrote. And I think this idea of learning from the land is really a key piece here, and seeing the land as a text and sort of providing that disruption in terms of what we think is a text, and that the land can be a text. So the activity embodies holism by engaging the land as a holistic text for multiplicities of experience, connecting the physical, spatial tracking and mathematics, the intellectual, storying and extrapolating, the emotional, response to disbelief and hidden truths, and the spiritual, relations to the dead. And I think the way you told the story just really embodies that holism as a principle in what learning can be on the land. And I think for me, you mentioned a few things. You called your stories math moments, but I also think what they truly are is a bit of a push or a nudge in terms of creating that disbelief or a counter narrative for what mathematics is. And you use that language that children, those youth, were bringing prior assumptions or bias about the land and maybe other things as well. But I think they also, you're trying to disrupt those biases or prior assumptions about what mathematics learning can be as well. And so that was something I particularly appreciated. We know children and youth have preconceived or already conceived assumptions about what mathematics is. And I think this learning that is interconnected and interrelated and holistic in nature helps disrupt that and broadens understandings of what mathematics is. And I think that that's a really essential role that we all play. I think I'll leave it at that. I love the story of the tree, Dahlia, and building on students' emergent questions that came in the moment, and supporting them with the mathematics that they could use to investigate their own questions. So thank you so much for sharing.
Great. Thank you, Sara and Janice, for sharing some of your appreciations, your questions, your understandings that you've gained from Dahlia's story. We're going to have a time later after our next presentation for questions. So what I'd like to suggest is, if you have questions for Dahlia, that you put it in the chat and we can look at those later and ensure that we discuss them. So
I'd like to introduce Karen now. Karen is a teacher of young people in Salmon Arm School District, and she is going to share some of her mathematical moments of becoming Storywork ready.
Again, my name is Karen Kehl, and I am, I work in School District 83, which is the North Okanagan Shuswap area, which is in central BC. I'm going to talk to you about my Storywork journey in finding and using Indigenous Storywork principles to engage my kindergarten grade 1 class in a 3-act math task. We'll just go to the next slide. I want to first acknowledge that I live in Salmon Arm, BC, on the traditional and unceded territories of the Secwepemc peoples. I teach kindergarten grade 1, and I am a guest on this land. I am non-Indigenous, and I really wanted it to make a passion of mine to try to use more Indigenous stories and Indigenous cultures in my teaching. And this Storywork journey that I'm going to describe will be how I used and try to find an Indigenous story to connect my students to the land and the place that they live in. We'll just move to the next slide. But my first inspiration for this sort of task and journey was I was driving my children down to the lake and for some lake hockey. And along the way, we noticed a sign, which I actually took a picture of, and it was a turtle crossing. And it got my own children wondering, you know, I didn't even realize there were turtles here. Why would there be a turtle crossing? So I thought, wow, that could be a really neat connection for my own kindergarten grade 1 students to see if they even have any connections to the land and the place that they live, and if they've noticed signs like this, or have noticed turtles that live here. So I brought the picture into my classroom, and it just started and sparked this wonderful way of wondering about the turtles, where they live in Salmon Arm, and why they would be here and where would they be crossing to. So it really started generating this sense of wonder in my class. So I thought, what a great opportunity it would be if I could find some Indigenous stories about turtle and make those connections to the land that we live, as well as through some math tasks. But like, including myself and many teachers that I've spoken to, there's this, because we're constantly learning about our local culture and land, we're always so fearful about misappropriating any aspects of it. And by using Joanne Archibald's Indigenous Storywork principles, specifically in this story, it's about respect and responsibility. I'm just going to describe my journey in what I learned in order to incorporate and get myself Storywork ready. Just the next slide. So I really concentrated on the 2 R's. So Joanne's first principle of respect taught me to look for an Indigenous story that was written by an Indigenous author. And in the search for my story, I really also wanted to have a local connection to the land and the place that I reside, to the Secwepemc peoples and territory. So I found that it was important to have that responsibility to have that local connection and the local teachings of the land and the culture and the history. But I also was so fearful about making assumptions that I really wanted to make sure that I my homework, if you will, and connect with some local knowledge keepers as well to make sure that the story that I would share with my class was actually a local story that connected to our Secwepemc peoples. So where to begin? And that's where a lot of teachers like myself think, where do we find these local stories? So my first investigation was actually through a website, Strong Nation Publishing. It's a publishing house that's based out of Nanaimo, BC. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. And not only can you put in keywords in this resource, in this website, for instance, turtle or specific content, it'll also tell you if the author was Indigenous or if the illustrator was Indigenous. And my favorite part, it also gives you a little bit of the history and culture where the story originated from, which was important. So I delved into Strong Nation Publishing. There's also another Canadian website called Good Minds Publishing that's based out of Ontario. And I wanted to find a story of turtle, and specifically within Secwepemc culture. And I couldn't find anything. I came up short. But what I did do was I went to my local district resource center and connected with some local knowledge keepers, specifically our ISW, which is our Indigenous support worker. And they helped me find this trilogy of Okanagan legends. And in this trilogy was a story called How Turtles Set the Animals Free. And I was overjoyed. I thought, oh, great. I have this connection to land and I have this connection to turtle. But it was written by the Okanagan peoples, which interestingly, the Syilx Okanagan Nation is the land and territory that is actually directly to the south of the Secwepemc Nation, and we share a border. So I thought, if we're so closely related, let's delve into some history. So with the help of my Indigenous support worker, we started looking up some historical context. And we found that the Syilx Nation, as well as the Secwepemc Nation, actually shared some hunting territory. As well as they shared some river systems. So I thought, with this connection, could they have actually shared this story as well? But out of Joanne's second principle of responsibility, it taught me the importance of making those connections with our local people, but also not making assumptions about how cultures could be, even though landscape-wise, they might actually be closely connected. Their cultures could be very different. So we delved a little bit further. And what we found was in Secwepemc law, in 7 sacred teachings, turtle actually represented patience and care. But in Syilx law, turtle represented harmony, togetherness, and community, which were very different. So even though the Syilx Okanagan Nation bordered the Secwepemc Nation to the south and our river systems are connected, looking at the land and looking at the culture and some of the history, we realized that it was very diverse, beautiful, but different. So the Syilx Nation has lakes. We have connected river systems, but their alpine forests are very different than our cedar hemlock forests here in Salmonar. And they also have desert landscapes and endangered grasslands. So with my students, we actually explored both landscapes, even though they were connected. And I still used this story, but to honor the Syilx Nation that it was from, we also delved into some of the landscape and culture that this story originated from. So to give you a brief brief idea, the story is about Turtle, who ended up taking on Eagle to try to set the animals free. And he raced, persevered, and set the animals free. And this was sort of the first story that we had told before our 3-act task. And it was such a neat story because, first of all, for the grade, kindergarten, grade 1, it really got them connected to not only the signs and the places that they saw turtles and salmon are, but it also gave them this piece of how we could be involved in community and that there's this sense of togetherness. We'll just go to the next slide. So the 3-act task was basically about how could you estimate the length of the turtle and how could you measure it? So that was the math behind the 3-act task. We'll go to the next slide. But once we got to Act 2, they had to show their thinking. How could they measure turtle? How could they measure each length after they made a prediction? And for some of my kindergartners, this became so incredibly frustrating. And this little gentleman there on the left was so frustrated. He didn't even know where to start. He had a Unifix cube, didn't even know how to connect them, and then just got overwhelmed. And his partner, who happened to be a grade 1 student, and she's in the picture there to the right, she out of the blue said, "I wonder what turtle would do." And they made this immediate connection to the story that was just read. They thought of this togetherness. They said, well, let's work together to solve the problem. So they got up out of their seats, they went right up to the board, and they started just brainstorming and making these connections, and the perseverance, they didn't give up. And it was such a great moment. And we'll just go to the next slide. So after they performed this 3-act task, and we talked about perseverance, and we talked about not giving up, we talked about those messages that we got from the original story, because they always kept coming back to it and making references to it, which was wonderful. So they started thinking of their own math problems that they wanted to come up with. So they wanted to measure the length of a baby turtle. They wanted to know the distance across the turtle crossing, which brought us back to our original sort of wonder. And our math started just sort of exploding from there. And but when we started thinking about the distance across the road or the turtle crossing, they started getting concerned about, well, who's going to protect our turtle? Who's going to keep them safe? How can we keep them safe? So it really got them to extend their thinking on, and again, this connection to place. So they decided to make posters. So you can see the turtle poster. These are 2 examples of what they drew. One was chalk paint. They decided to do turtle signs across our school on the sidewalks, and they also put posters up to let the community know that we have turtles, endangered turtles here in Salmon Arm, and then we need to be careful while they cross the roads. So it was that really unique connection to place. So from my whole Storywork journey, not only did I get a chance to develop a really excellent working relationship with our local Indigenous support workers here at the schools, it also sort of helped me come over and overcome my original fear of misappropriating any of the culture or language. And becoming Storywork ready helped me actually go through a lot of, especially when I couldn't find a local story, it just helped me find ways that I could still connect my students to the land and the culture of the Secwepemc peoples. And it also helped me find stories that were age appropriate for the age that I was working with. What my students gathered from the story connections to the math that we did And the meetings were priceless. I still have students coming up to me this year that I taught last year, and they still have the connections to turtle, and they still look for the crossings. And when wondering when we're doing it again, so they could help with some of the chalk paint. So they've become their own environmental stewards and caretakers, and all from this connection with Indigenous Storywork. So thank you, Joanne, for taking me on this journey. And I'm just so very grateful that it's still something that I'm still working on and learning from, and I'm continuing to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Another transformative story, that mathematical moment of becoming Storywork ready. And so we see Gagit again here with us. And just before we hear from our witnesses, and then also open it up for questions from all of those who are attending, all of our participants, I just want to have us meet again Gagit. You can see this, it's hard to tell in this image, but this is a huge mask. It is actually probably as long, like maybe 1.5 meters, 6 feet or so long, and weighs a great deal. You can see these 2 lines that are coming from the nose. And when I was with Reg Davidson, when he was building this and putting the 2 faces together, he was trying to work out the mechanics on the hinges of trying to open this up from performing it from being behind the mask. And when the mask would open up, you would see this would be the inside. And if you were to perform or dance the mask, you were able to, from the inside, close it and open it. So it shares a beautiful kind of power of thinking about this transformation between human and Gagit, the power of being able to kind of be in this tenuous place of being on the edge in some ways, of being between the human where the spirit doesn't die, human, and then in between the other part of that where the spirit doesn't die. And I think in both of these stories that you've shared, both Dahlia and Karen have kind of helped us think more about these ideas of transformation and how learning and teaching can be transformative. So I want to now invite our witnesses to say a few words about each of those presentations.
I want to acknowledge Karen's authenticity and vulnerability in sharing her journey in terms of taking on and learning about Storywork principles. And as a non-Indigenous educator myself, I've been on the same journey with you and continue to learn. And I think for me, using a framework like Storywork from Joanne is helpful in terms of framing our thinking and that responsibility that we have to learning experiences that we create with the students that are in our care. And I think about how you spent the time and seeing that as both respect and responsibility, and using those principles before you engaged with your students on a math task about the learning that you and your students in your care needed to do to be ready to hear that story and the connections to place. And I really appreciated how you uncovered this with your students about the similarities and differences between the 2 nations in your area and why that might be, and the different lenses we might need to take because of that. I also appreciate how you described that the turtle had different significance to the different nations, being different cultures. I think we have to be so careful that we don't, pan-generalize about animals and what they mean. And I know that comes up often in education discussions with non-Indigenous educators that I work with, making those sort of big generalizations about what a bear means or what an owl means and how it's very culturally specific. And so I really appreciated you raising that as you told your story. I really also really appreciated the time that the math task in itself wasn't a huge task, but the time that you took setting things up and all the mathematics that was actually explored leading up to the math task, through looking at maps, through thinking about time and timelines, through thinking about turtles and, you know, their lifespan and how they travel and why there's a crossing at a certain place and how long that might take. And, you know, I think about often when we're, you know, teaching young children, we read a story, we do something, and then we move on. And I just think you've opened up this idea that we need to revisit stories and spend some time with them and revisit them over and over again. And then, you know, that creates opportunities for students to notice different things, notice different mathematical opportunities for us to play with, different inquiry questions that might come up. So I just think slowing down and spending time with an idea and a story is so important. So I think you really captured that, Karen, in the way you told your story and the way that you honored the principles, you know, in terms of respect and responsibility in particular. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Janice. And Sara, some insights.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing with us today. What I really loved is the way that you started by looking for a story, an Indigenous story, to connect the land and specifically the place that you live, make that connection for students. And in the work that I do, I call it localizing, and I think that is so important, that we look to the local. And I really appreciated that you were willing to seek out a story that was connected to specifically to the nation whose land you're working on right now. And I appreciated the fact that this whole idea emerged from, you know, driving down a road that potentially your students are also driving on. And so it wasn't this sort of, oh, I think students really need to learn how to, you know, protect turtles. And so you began from this experience and the wonderings that you had in seeing that sign and then sharing that with the students and inviting them to engage in their own processes. And it was wonderful to hear that the Indigenous Storywork principles helped you to feel confident to be able to begin this work. And your willingness to seek support and to sort of think about how do we follow these principles in this particular context. And when I'm struggling, you know, that willingness to share that you are, you know, that you know, where you went. And that said, I'm currently collaborating with somebody who also does this work of kind of modeling the process that we go through. And I think that is so helpful for other educators to both hear that everybody, you know, we're all kind of struggling with this work, and we're, you know, we have some ideas about it. And I would like to echo Janice's point about your willingness to be a bit vulnerable with us today about the process that you went through. And I know that in my experience, it's been so helpful for folks to hear from non-Indigenous folks who are taking up this work. So the care with which you shared each step of the way in how you set up this experience for your students was really wonderful to hear. And, you know, your questions and what you were thinking at the time, and you know, the decisions that you made based on the information that you have. And you know, we often hope that we have the answers to all of the questions before we proceed, so we can proceed without making mistakes. And ultimately, we do have to make choices and decisions based on the information that we have. And so I'm grateful that you were willing to share that with us today. And the connection that you made to the story, you know, that was around a kind of supporting a personal connection. And you know, when I think about questions that invite students to make meaning, or learners to make meaning from story, as opposed to demonstrating comprehension, so that connection you made with share a time when you didn't give up was sort of a lovely way to engage and support that meaning making that we hope to see with when we're working and learning from Indigenous stories. And I really loved the way that the connection with the story, developing a relationship with the story, supported a relationship with the local turtles. And so that, you know, it invited students to really think deeply about the well-meaning of turtles. And I love that it inspired action in them, and that you were able to support them to be active in engaging in some education and perhaps some turtle activism to support the well-being of the turtles. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Sara. And there was some math in there too.
I don't see the world in mathematics. I see the world in stories. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, mathematics is a story. It's another way of, it's a story of seeing the world in patterns, relationships, position. There's story all through that. Yeah, this can't be separated, but we can go there another time. But thank you very much to Sara and Janice for your thoughtful comments and insights, and to both Dahlia and Karen for sharing those moments of becoming storywork ready in the context of teaching and learning mathematics. We have some time now for questions from the audience. If anyone would like to or has a question, you could either unmute and just jump right in, or you could take a moment and just form a question and put it in the chat, and we'll read it out for you if you like. Or if anybody has a question or a comment, or just something that, an insight that you noticed, or even a story that you of an experience that you are would like to share with us. We'd love to hear. We'd love to hear from you.
My question was sort of about the transformation that you saw in your students after, I'm assuming that this was a shift in how you were supporting engagement with mathematics. And I'm just curious to hear more about the impacts that it had on your students following those various experiences.
Thank you, Sara. Would you like to start, Dahlia?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Yeah, well, I mean, the transformation in the kind of the debrief, like at the end of the activity, was definitely notable in terms of a lot of sharing about math, because at the beginning, we asked the participants to share, their relationships with mathematics, and there was a variety of different responses to that, varied feelings. And by the end of it, there was, this appreciation that was expressed for math, and how it can be seen anywhere, everywhere. And, the things that they had been working on, such as the tracking, now they were seeing it through mathematical lenses, which they expressed in that. And afterwards, after that activity, I don't work regularly with the group, so I haven't had the opportunity to see how it's continued to evolve in their continuing education. I know that they continue to do land-based activities regularly. But I did have the opportunity to connect with a few different parents afterwards who were sharing with me, also because I wrote a story about it afterwards. And so I did get to speak to some parents who really expressed appreciation for introducing math in those ways. And I think that it was something that through those conversations, it was clear that parents would like to see those kinds of things more in schools. And this was an opportunity, an out of school opportunity, but it really sheds light on how the possibilities of how math can be integrated with all sorts of different ways of knowing and engaging. And so that was important to hear, I think, from parents as well.
Thank you, Dahlia. Yeah, that feedback from parents and family and community is really helpful for moving forward with this kind of work. Karen, would you have some thoughts from Sara's question about transformation?
Well, I think the one thing I can say that I noticed was just there was that perseverance piece. So some of the students that were a little reluctant because they didn't feel confident with their measuring or their counting or with their numbers, I found that obviously working with partners in a math investigation helped. But once you incorporated the story work, as well as just that connection to land and place, it's almost like they forgot that they were doing math. And so they felt more confident about it. I don't know how else to explain it other than that. Cynthia, you might be able to throw in some math terms for me, maybe, just so I can have some more, you know, an inspiring answer. But yeah, like those students that felt that were always quiet during math or were a little reluctant, they were just participating wholeheartedly. And like I said, it was almost like they were finding their own connections without even realizing that they were connecting to math. So it gave them that confidence that I wouldn't normally see in just, you know, a regular sort of math lesson, so to speak. So I think that was the immediate transformation that I saw. And the fact that they were posing their own math problems afterwards and inquiries. I mean, I think that was, I know Janice, I mean, you've had a lot of, you know, experience in that, but, you know, their math posing questions afterwards with those connections, I was inspiring. I think that was the one thing that I found that I got the most out of it, the direction that they took it.
Yeah, the power of story. Okay? So Janice, you maybe jump in. You're an expert on problem posing.
I mean, I think, Karen, I think stories are such a great starting place. And I think your point about children not realizing they're doing math sometimes, I think we need to remember that math is a construct. It's a human construct. And again, whenever we can do things that are more holistic and interconnected, and story is a place to do that. So story creates meaning, whether it's an oral story, a written story, or, you know, the land as a story, because the land and the waters and the skies hold stories in them. And so I think there's so many opportunities for students to inquire, ask questions, and then from that pose problems. And sometimes those problems may be, you know, what we would call a word problem more traditionally, but some of those problems lead to action. And this is where social justice and all sorts of other things can come in, as you saw with the turtles, and then wanting to make posters and signs. And that's sort of a natural evolution of students asking questions that lead to investigations, that lead to problems arising that they want to investigate and solve.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just I think the power again of story. I know what I was going to say is another place for stories is just experiential stories, our own experiences, which I would say, Karen, is that was kind of what you were starting with, was you and your students or your family noticed that sign, and then the conversation started. So bringing in our own experiences of stories and relationships and place and connections to land can be a way to start and explore mathematically.
And I think, Cynthia, I'm just going to add that also, you know, speaks to identities and the identities that children bring into our classrooms. And, you know, often, Karen, you mentioned that your students maybe had not a positive math identity, or were shy or quiet to share. And, you know, story and these experiences are a way for students to see themselves as mathematicians and to see mathematics as something maybe different than what they have a perception of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a question from Michelle Miller-Gauthier. Michelle, would you like to ask that? It's in the chat too, but I thought you might want to say.
Sure. Thank you. I was just wondering if Karen could speak to communicating learning with families when you're exploring mathematics in this way that's connected to Indigenous pedagogies, because a lot of what we do as educators traditionally have been to show a piece of paper that has something like looks like numbers on it, and how do you work at this in new ways?
I actually do a monthly newsletter, which sort of showcases some of the learning that we're doing. And so, I wonder if I even have. Yes, I do have one on my wall, but with my blurred background, you may not see it. But what I do is I'll take a snapshot of the learning that we're doing, whether it's a picture in the classroom of them being engaged, or if it's outdoors where we're doing some spatial learning, and then I just incorporate it in the newsletter. And it gives the parents a little bit of a snapshot of what we're doing and how we're doing it and how we're incorporating Indigenous culture in our everyday tasks. So so far it's been the parents are very thankful for getting those types of snapshots and glimpses into their children's learning. But I mean, I'll be honest with you too. Sometimes, Indigenous learning and culture sometimes contradicts some other, religious faith that that a family may have. So I try to honor some of the religious faith as well, by letting them know in advance, how we're going to be incorporating some Indigenous culture within our learning. And then they can make a choice of how they'd like to receive that, if that helps. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hi, Cynthia and everybody.
Nice to see you.
I was trying to figure out how to type this into the chat, and I thought I'm just gonna ask it verbally because it's easier. So it's always been really important to me with both kids and adults, when I see them doing something or interacting with something that is math, that I would point out, oh, look at all this math you're doing, whether it's art or whether we're walking down the street with my kids. Oh, this is, look at this math, look at that math. And then I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day whose research is in social justice math. And he was saying, no, I don't do that because it might alienate somebody who doesn't see it as math, or it might even be offensive to some people to put this colonial label of math onto something like carving or beading or whatever. And so obviously I do a lot of work in this area, and now I'm really having this like philosophical, I don't know, debate within my own head, because I still kind of feel like more people would benefit from you saying, like, look at how your artistic abilities are also like math abilities, but now I kind of have this little voice in the back of my head going, yeah, but maybe not. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, I've got lots of people here who have a lot of experience in this area, and I'm just wondering what people think about that, or where people land as far as being explicit about things being math or mathematical, rather than just doing the things and calling them what they are.
Do you mean, Jess, in terms of being explicit, that these are the mathematical ideas and concepts that we're working on, versus having that just kind of come through in the task? Not sure I understand.
Yeah, and saying to, say, a student who identifies as an artist but not a mathematician, like, oh yeah, you're an artist and you're amazing at art, but do you recognize that you're also doing math, right? Mm-hmm. Me thinking that then the student is going to go, oh wow, I knew I was a great artist, but now I also realize that I'm kind of mathy too. Whereas my colleague was saying, well, but it could also go the other way. They might say, oh my God, like, I hate math and I can't do math, so maybe I'm not as good as art as I thought I was, or something like that, right? That we shouldn't worry about labeling it as math. Yeah, and I'm really, really like, I don't know how I feel about that, because I don't know how I feel about that. I would like to know how other people feel, or what people's experience is with that, because my experience has always been better connection. So I'm just wondering if other people have different experiences.
So you're putting the question out to the group, and I see that Kristen in Insol, who is Kristen, has given where did it go? Sorry, it went. Oh, here we go. She suggests and found useful for her the two-eyed seeing perspective. we're holding a Western observation and an Indigenous perspective in both hands without saying one is the other or putting one above the other, but holding them together. And perhaps that speaks to that holistic view that Janice was also referring to earlier, is rather than it being one or the other, it's that both and, you know, they're occurring together. And that's what I'm taking from Kristen's point. Maybe somebody else has an idea to jump into the conversation. We have like only a minute or so left before we wrap up, but does anybody else have a comment to Jess's very good question? Dahlia? Yeah, please just unmute and go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say just briefly, my immediate response is just that I feel like the issue there is not about math per se or art per se, but it's about the labels, the words that we're using. And you know, there is mathematics in Indigenous epistemologies. There always has been, and there always has been art in that as well. But you know, mathematics has been, in the way that we understand it, has become a colonial concept that is distinct from you know, art and science and all of these other, and language, and also art itself has also become co-opted as a colonialized discipline in that same way. And so I think that, you know, those words and what they mean, they represent these disciplines which are Western disciplines, but you know, all of the practices and experiences underneath those are not necessarily Western concept. There, you know, so there's a whole world of practice within those. So I think that that's a challenge that we confront with language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, language and labeling. Thank you, Dahlia. So maybe we can just wrap up with our closing remarks now that we're ready to a minute or so that is left. And so we want to thank all of our speakers, especially Karen and Dahlia, for sharing their moments and their stories and sharing it as a story. So you're actually kind of modeling this idea of what you were actually speaking to. And also for our witnesses, Janice and Sara, for being able to be so eloquent and beautiful in your remarks that kind of help us see another perspective and point to some of the important aspects to the work. And Joanne, do you have any comments that you would like to end with? I guess we should just also end with the next session. Maybe you can do that if you like.
Sure. Well, this has been a wonderful gathering, and we could think of this as, you know, one of four, so that, you know, we often traditionally in our gatherings, we would spend days together. So we could think of this as a beginning of us joining together and sharing some of our experiences, what we've learned, what have been some of the challenges, and also thinking about, you know, what are some other questions that we actually couldn't get to and that are listed in the chat, but we could take those and think about how we might address those in the session that will be on January 23rd. And that, you know, I hope that we are, you know, going away from this webinar full of ideas. We've had a rich feast of ideas about bringing together Indigenous stories, whether they're traditional or life experience stories, together with math learning, and also thinking about communities that it could be Indigenous communities, it could be the community of learners, the students with whom you work, and teachers in your schools, and us together as this bigger community where we can probably, I hope, be challenged to thinking about this idea of transformation, the Gagid, where perhaps, thinking about that image, and how do we move to thinking about the transformation, and we're still might be the same thing, but we can somehow change our thinking perhaps, or our perspective, or be challenged to think in an entirely different way. So that's what we hope this webinar series will do for all of you. And I do raise my hands and thanks and respect to our presenters, Dahlia and Karen, and also to Sara and Janice. You're wonderful witnesses. My goodness, all those thoughts that you've shared, and we also chose this form of witnessing as a form of an Indigenous pedagogy, how we can, again, reciprocity, learn from each other, and that we can share those thoughts and also questions. So we look forward to seeing you all again on January 23rd, and our theme is the power of teaching and learning mathematics through land and place. So, and please fill in that poll, and we'll see you next time.